than the landscape itself. I can be thinking about a mountain range for a quarter of an hour, but I immediately run to speak with the shepherd or lumberjack on that mountain range. Then, when I'm writing, I remember one of those dialogues and the authentic expression of the people comes out. I have a huge archive of memories from my childhood, hearing people talk. It's poetic memory, and I stand by that.
Yeah, I was rereading that quote on this morning. I gotta find it. I mean, you just sent it to me. I wanted to Google where she
Yeah,
got that quote
I
from.
can ask her where she got it because I'm sure it's been translated better. You know, I mean, there are lots of quotes in there from, like, there's a quote in there from Plath that I translated. And I thought, well, why would I translate this if I can go and look at Plath and see it, you know? So my translation was way off, of course. But to think of, yeah, yeah. So what do you think of that?
I mean, there's so many things that was going through my mind. I was just thinking sort of more broadly about why he's saying this to begin with, and he kind of says it in the beginning about how people think this about my work, but really it's this thing. And so the first thing that I wanted to say is like how how every text implies some kind of argument, you know. And I don't mean you know, I don't necessarily mean the violence of an argument, although sometimes that there's a kind of vehemence or a passion that extends into kind of a conflict. What I mean is something more along the lines of the Greek idea of agon, of kind of struggle, and this, he's struggling with his perception of how poems get made and how he actually makes these poems. So that brings me to the second thing that I noticed from the beginning of the quote, which is that he's he's saying that people see, this is how I'm reading the quote, people see his work as a product of his genius, of his originality, of his bold imagination as a poet. And I think what he's doing in this quote is really acknowledging and affirming his role as a poet is really to record. And the process of recording requires him to sit still, to be quiet, and then to follow this impulse, which is to be in conversation with this other person. And all those things I think are fundamental, certainly to my work and to a lot of the work, the work of a lot of folks that I know. And then the other detail, of course, is this idea of what you said in the beginning, el paisaje del campo, is, you know, los campesinos. These are the, it's not, perhaps not even just the fact of rural life and the people who live in rural places, but the fact of them being neglected in literature. And I think that is also a tradition that I can relate to, is like, what are the places, the people, the sensations that that don't seem to be attended to in this particular moment in history or throughout our history. So even in that very small sort of terse passage, like there's all these implications about what the role of the poet is, the relationship between the poet and the perceptions of society and his ostensible subject, or the sources of his work.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I agree completely. You know, I got a little stuck, or not stuck on, but kind of I guess I'm fixating on this idea of, you know, where art comes from or where it can come from. We always think that it's this really elevated. It has to be elevated, it has to come from the mind, and you know, you can't copy. You can't be taken from someone else. And Lorca is saying, I'm using the language, the dialect, the observations of the people I grew up with.
Yeah.
Right? That's nothing new, right?
Yeah.
And I think that that's such a liberating understanding, or it can be liberating in that, you know, we don't have to, you know, write in a certain way that is beyond us, other than, think of who we are, where we're coming from, and how that has its unique qualities. And that's what makes us the writers we are. Right?
Yeah. It makes me wonder, like, we put such a value on like invention and genius. And I'm like, what's the difference between invention and preservation? I mean, I think that there's a dictionary difference, but the idea of preserving these ways of speaking, and even in a more stranger sense, because Lorca is so weird and surreal, like there's a way that strangeness is already inside of us, that we inherit that epigenetically, culturally, psychologically, psychically. And one of the things that we do as artists is sort of preserve that strangeness by going in, traveling inward, and retrieving it, because it's being threatened with loss. I think that one of the poignant things too about this is him running out to see the shepherd, in this particular moment where we're like I'm looking at each of you in boxes, in this is a kind of digital solitude, and this really fundamental part of art is it's social for Lorca. We know that he was a really gregarious person to begin with, but in this passage, he's talking about how crucial it is for him to be literally in conversation with other people. I miss it for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And even that, when we're looking at this screen, we can see some faces, and then there's just the name, and what that is like. And you think about the metaphor of the blank stare, right? This is the blank stare of not seeing anyone, not seeing.
Yeah, we're looking at you.
Really, I look at Layla, Mary, Rose, Sue, and I think, what are they doing back there? They don't have to show their cameras, but it is, to think about that, these changes that we're undergoing, and how we have to, we're growing, and we have to kind of go with it, but yeah, this is, I think there was just a question there. I find the tension between urban and rural for me is always interesting, and preserving the rural bandwidth. Yeah, I think those, that's, you might even think of, and something that I think about a lot with Patrick and your work are, as you know, I'm fascinated with borders and frontiers, and kind of shifting, going across different, entering different terrain, and to think about how you negotiate. The easiest way would be to say different registers, but different communities, and to think about how you can be comfortable in the United States, but also in the Philippines, and different parts of the United States, right? And in my case, Spain is like my second home. Sometimes it feels even more familiar than where I live right now in Texas, and how language also allows us entrance into these different places. But I like that word that Paul used, tension, right? And how do we negotiate and use tension in that way?
Maybe I can circle back to that, but one thing that I wanted to say about the Lorca quote too, and sort of this moment of the conversation is, I'm so interested in the local, and I'm just like, me in New Jersey, just like you can't take it out of me. I was born here. I was raised here, and my sense of the local has always been my local is comprised of many locals, because this is such a place of so many kinds of people and so many immigrants. And so I, when I began to travel much later, as you know, in my 30s, is really when I started to be in places other than the New York City metropolitan area. One of the things I found that I could do was learn how to love what other people love in their own local places. You know, like, there's a better way of saying that, but there's a way of being in other places and paying attention and really learning how other people love what they love, you know? And so that tension, I think, to come back to Paul's quote, I didn't see it, but I'm sort of referring to what you said, Curtis. This tension between the urban and the rural is a, I mean, it implies this distance, this disconnect, this conflict even, and I'm interested in that difference, but I'm also interested, I guess, in these different ways that folks who grow up in a rural setting or in an urban setting love something. And in order to love something, you have to pay attention to it. So I'm also really interested in the ways that people pay attention to things, you know, and the practices of attention and the feelings that come about as a result of paying attention to very, very particular things. So I think that Lorca is about that too. I mean, like, part of the reason why he delivered that talk on Duende was because, you know, this is just mere decades after the final blow to the Spanish Empire, and so the nation is under this kind of identity crisis, and Lorca is looking to art, and not just sort of the traditional Spanish classical expressions of art, but folkloric art, the art of the gypsies, the art of the country. And so that in itself, I mean, despite the fact that these are Romani peoples who have wandered, or maybe because their relationship to place is particular in their many routes, Lorca is also really interested in the local, and what that means in terms of observation, in terms of attention, in terms of the way that you are transformed by attention, and how that transformation is itself a kind of love. I think that all of this stuff is related to the ways that we read poems and make art in general. I want to say that I would much rather.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
So if you have questions or comments, please drop them in the chat. It'd be really, really awesome. I know you feel the same way, Curtis, although I think that we probably arrived at it in different ways. Like, one of the images that recurs when I think about our time in grad school together is you. I don't know if I made this, but at least it's true metaphorically, at least in my mind, but like, you kind of being out in the fields of Iowa, like wanting to get the fuck out, like looking at the highway that goes through all those fields, maybe even sitting on a tractor and being like, I need to get the fuck out of here. And so your relationship to place has, first of all, it's driven by a feeling probably initially of feeling constrained, but that feeling propelled you to look, to travel, and that feeling probably also evolved because your relationship to the rural has evolved since I've known you in the last 2.5 decades too.
Yeah, you know, I was looking at something that Sejal had written about meeting you in New York, and you were saying you were from New Jersey, and I mean, I think a lot of people from Jersey are proud to be from Jersey.
To a fault, man.
I mean, for me, I wasn't proud to be from Iowa. I wanted, like, as you said, I wanted to get the hell out of it. And part of that, Sejal, I grew up in eastern Iowa, near Iowa City, the Amana colonies, and Interstate 80 dissected our property, right? So I've got a poem in my first book about being in a tractor and just watching this traffic go, east and west, and wanting to get on that Greyhound, either go to LA or New York City. And I would always see those Greyhounds, right? And not until after graduate school, when I moved back to Iowa because of my wife going to the University of Iowa for a PhD, did I come to terms with being from that place and feel more comfortable, I guess, saying, I'm from Iowa. And I'll even say, I mean, I'm not as concerned about that now as I used to be. So there's a certain, I guess that idea of coming to terms with who you are, where you're from, what that does, how that makes someone. But I needed to go live in Mexico and in Spain before I could figure that out, right?
Could I ask a more specific question, which is like, how, I don't even know if this is answerable on your part, but I'm curious about how did leaving Iowa and eventually going back to it and then leaving it again, just all your sort of relationships to place, how did it affect your relationship to sound? Like, I'm asking a question about attention, but particularly the kinds of things that you hear in and out of language in different places.
I think.
How did it affect the way that you listen also, I think, is the other question.
Yeah, definitely how I listen, but just an awareness, I mean, even before sound, the really general language, not even thinking about language when I was growing up as much as, or other than, my grandparents spoke German, my great uncle spoke Welsh. So that was just a really natural thing to hear, that kind of foreignness. But I wasn't fluent in that. I was just aware of it. But going away and coming back changed, that having lived in Spain and having, lived in Spanish for years, when I went back to Iowa, it was a completely different experience being in Iowa, listening to those communities and listening to the people that I grew up with, how they spoke, and finding that, a real, I mean, this is one of the things that I'm drawn to about Lorca, right? Thinking, when I was younger, had I had that kind of awareness, I think my early poems would have been a lot different.
Huh.
I mean, there's a certain dialect in Eastern Iowa that is really hard to hear, but you can hear it when you're there. In particular, farmers, like rural communities, how quickly or slowly they speak, how they clip their words. There's things there that I wasn't really aware of having lived there. And that's something that in New Jersey, I think we're more attuned to that, where because of the languages you spoke in your home, and then the language you had to speak when you're outside of it, I didn't have to do that, right? I mean, and I think that's really interesting about these different places where we grow up, what you're forced to do, and how if you're not forced to do anything, you don't recognize it, right? And what does that say about our country? I mean, there's a lot of shit going on because people haven't been forced to do things, haven't been forced to think about things. And I think that the multilingual aspect of our country has been covered up for a long time. Right? Even though I grew up in a multilingual place, it was accepted more because it was traditional, I guess.
Can I jump in there? There was a question in the chat a while ago, and I think this conversation lends itself to it, which is, the impact of different places on you, different languages. And it was a question about how you've evolved as a writer. And I think of it as a question maybe about how each of your work has changed over the years, but also maybe a question of the process by how we evolve, like whether we, there's always the pressure to find your voice, and yet we're changing, adapting people, and so we can also be stuck at that. So how do we let ourselves evolve and change when we find ourselves, like you, Curtis, in a different location, a different place?
That's that would have been an easier question for me to answer even just 5 years ago, but things have gotten, I think you're asking me that question, or I'm hearing that question now at a particular sort of crisis moment in my imaginative life, and I'm thinking about crisis not necessarily as catastrophe, but just as change. So I came to books and poetry very, very late, and so there was this hunger to sort of learn how to read essentially a strange new language, and I've spent the last quarter century now learning how to do that. And the things that I learned and had become lodged in my mind as skills for writing poems are now, I'm starting to question them. Things that I depended on for me to write poems, I'm not rejecting them, but I'm asking if at this particular point in my life, if they're limiting me. And I guess I can be more specific in saying that I don't really know what a poem is anymore. I think that I could tell you how I wrote my poems. That's why last night when I was answering questions about like line endings like that, I was being a little bit evasive because I was much more prescriptive in my talks and certainly in my own process to myself. And my process is much more open now. And it's freed me up to do things like make music and make collages and drawings and do collaborations in public art and do guerrilla style kind of art projects. And there's something really exciting about kind of obliterating the demands that I had put on my own poetry to discover what else might be possible. Now, other kinds of constraints might come out of this current sort of period of questioning, but I think that that's like sort of the biggest. I'm not giving you the evolution. I'm sort of giving you like the beginning and the sort of the latest iteration. But right now, I'm really. It's not even so much about like my identity as a writer. It's my identity as a person and my identity as an artist, and that I'm really embracing all of these things that brought me to poetry in the first place, but I had to kind of leave out because of the formal instruction and the formal demands of publishing. I couldn't really identify as a dancer. I couldn't identify as a musician. I couldn't identify as a composer. All those things were deeply involved in the way that I made my poems, but now I'm more purposeful about not just those practices, but the ways that they're in conversation with the way that I compose on the page. So knowing that I'm talking to people now who are studying in an M.F.A. program, it's like it all belongs. All of your work, all of your study, all of your conversations, from cooking to gardening to collage to music to dancing to race car driving, whatever the craft is that brought you to writing, whatever you think that is like, oh, that thing is separate. No, it all belongs. It has a lexicon and a vocabulary that's going to inform and even as you're focused on the craft of writing now, to know that there are going to be moments where it's going to return and serve you, and maybe even sort of reopen your imagination to rethink the form and genre itself. That may happen sooner than later. It may happen much later in life, as it has happened to me. So, yeah, I think that some really big changes in the ways that I sort of employ my imagination are happening right now.
that reminds me of Tom Lux, right? I mean, when you think of how it all belongs, if you're not familiar with Thomas Lux's poetry, look it up. We studied with Tom, and you just look at his titles, and everything went into his poems, everything that he was reading, everything he was listening to. And another of our teachers who wasn't our teacher, but we read him, Larry Levis, right? And you think about how Levis was reaching out to film, he was reaching out to, his rural upbringing, all of these things were coming into it, right? I think it's really, really fascinating how all of that works, how it all comes together.
I would like to hop in. I think one of the things, Patrick, you were saying, it makes sense, like the way in which you explain your poetry and kind of how you write. I think that's one of the reasons why I identify with your work so well, because you come from just this different perspective of entering into a poem. And so you don't have that idea of what a poem is. And so I think that's something that I'm now realizing about my work too. That's what makes it so relatable and allows people to be so connected to your work, because it's forming in a way that isn't from the traditional way of forming a poem, or like you don't have a traditional understanding of what a poem is. And so I think that allows folks to be able to come in and really like connect to what you're writing. So I'm like, this makes sense now.
Yes, absolutely. That sort of reminds me, like, I know that we're kind of in the business of giving advice, and I'm trying to refrain from doing that, but so maybe I can formulate this in another way, Heather. But I think one of the things in this journey of like not coming from a traditional route, one thing that I have kept in my mind in one form or another is protect your strangeness and cultivate your dream life. Because I don't mean this in a paranoid sense, but it's always under attack. The fact of its strangeness puts it in exile, and various sort of intellectual and cultural forces want to keep it in exile. But what the imagination wants to do is say, come.
Mm-hmm.
You have singing to do. And so I think it's really important, and that's one of the things that actually defines our solitude, the 15 or 20 people who are in this Zoom right now. It's what distinguishes us from one another is the particularity of our imaginations, our strangeness from one another. But the irony is that particularity and that strangeness is also what brings us together, because there's this kernel of mysteriousness to ourselves that we as artists are trying to approach every day, every time we go to the page. I want to get to that thing that is my life force, that is my love, that was handed down to me, and which I'll also hand over. And that's the most gratifying part, because I think that when you get close to it, that's when the work begins to resonate. The craft is it's great to learn that stuff, and it's important to learn that stuff. But to me, that journey, that attempt, that approach to that mysteriousness, that strangeness, that's what we call soul.
Yeah. And you're putting language to it, which is also what I'm getting really, really excited about, because like having the thoughts and then trying to like take the thoughts from your mind to someone else, to the paper, like that's sometimes the hard part. It's like, it, but you can't articulate it. And you're like putting language to a lot of the thoughts that I've been having. So thank you for that, because aha moments.
Yes. So do I.
Thank you for the phrase, protect your strangeness.
Yeah.